The situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There is no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar Podcast find this intolerable, and we stand behind the Burmese people and their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going, while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those voices, and I invite you to settle in and open up to what follows.
So I am from Vietnam. I guess nationally I am Vietnamese, but I think my identity is much more connected to being a Southeast Asian. Um, and I grew up in Vietnam, studying elsewhere, and only get to know about Myanmar um, in recent years. And I guess I'm also sharing this as a precaution for what I'm sharing during this episode, that a lot of my connections to Myanmar is through personal. The work that I'm doing, which is focusing on solidarity, regional solidarity, and supporting peace processes, peace building in Southeast Asia, which include Myanmar. Um, and before I used to work in migration in the Mekong region, which also have a lot to do with Myanmar. But I think um, the the connections I have with Myanmar and the motivation that I have with knowing more about Myanmar, sharing my own personal solidarity with Myanmar, is driven by my kind of personal curiosity about the place, especially the political struggle after 2021, um, and 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 also the solidarity with the folks that I met along the way, either in Thailand or outside, who are committed to the cause in Myanmar. Um, and that lead me to a lot of reflection that I have on my own activism and the history that my own country went through.
That's awesome. So, if to break down and unpack a bit of some of the things you teased out there in that introduction, first of all, I'm interested in hearing the shape of the solidarity that you describe with your Burmese friends and colleagues in seeing what they're doing, and the solidarity with that struggle, and then how that friendship and inspiration from through that shared solidarity with them then led you into, as you say, this reflection on your own country and history.
Right. I think solidarity right now becomes a big word and becomes a buzzword. Um, but I think, down to the essence of solidarity, it's really about kind of being there. And the the solidarity that I have with my friends, um, are simply that, there were the friends that I met after the coup in Myanmar, during my grad schools are politically involved and involved in their own struggle, um, and there's just a lot of ups and downs personally when there are political events and developments in Myanmar that affect them personally. And so just kind of sympathizing with the situation of Myanmar is a start of a lot of these conversations. And then beyond that, along the way, we start to think about how to support them more, how the communities in Southeast Asia can be available to support friends in Myanmar, and reflecting on my own communities of friends and activists and artists and etc. in Vietnam and elsewhere, um, to first be interested in to know about Myanmar, and then to offer any support if possible. Obviously, the tricky part about solidarity is solidarity starts with information,
Mm.
and so um, it's not. Let's do a comparison of Myanmar and, let's say, Gaza, right? For just for a better way to an easier way to look at it. So the media coverage of Ukraine or Gaza, for example, is easily accessible to international audience, and mm, to some extent also the media coverage around Myanmar. Um, um, but I think with constant international media coverage comes with a way to sustain the momentum of information and support for a situation. And so I think for Myanmar, the tricky part is that information comes in 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 small bits, and not very sustained, and therefore it appears that just every once in a while you hear about Myanmar, you don't hear that the situation is moving forward. So what's more to learn about it? And therefore, that's very difficult to sustain an international solidarity movements um, when there's no constant support of constant um, supplier of information and um, and just connections to sustain the solidarity. Um, I I heard before someone say that Myanmar is, if what Gaza is globally, is what Myanmar is regionally
Hmm.
in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I think the truth goes beyond, that Myanmar is the most brutal atrocity, the epicenter of injustice in Southeast Asia. I think that's absolutely true. The same way as Gaza. But beyond that, I think that the same way that a lot of political imagination of the progressive movements around the world is pouring into um, the injustice that is going on in Palestine. I think a lot of activists in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, look at Myanmar as a channel for their political imagination also, and their political reflection.
Mm.
Um, and therefore, I think that's a very strong supplier of solidarity energy
Yeah.
that pour into Myanmar, because that's what solidarity is. It's in a way a give or take, a give and take. That we're giving solidarity, but in that process, we're also reflecting on and nurturing our own activism and our own political imagination, which in spaces like uh, um, very constrained like Vietnam and other countries, um, we have a scarcity of that imagination, right?
Mm. That's fascinating. And what you say, if I can extrapolate on that in a personal sense, it's reminding me of what happens when an individual is going through a personal tragedy or trauma, and during that time, you you really know who your friends are by who shows up. Um, but the fascinating thing in this personal example is that your friend showing up to help you through a personal crisis, it's actually not one way street, however it would look like to really be there for a friend that's going through trauma. You do have to open yourself up to something beyond pity, and something of a true feeling of their pain and their suffering in a way that can actually hurt you on some emotional level, to tap into a shared humanity. And so through helping a grieving friend, you're actually tapping into this wider humanity, that those support units are also able to feel something of the fuller human experience that you don't get when you're shielding yourself off, that can be scary and uncomfortable and also take time, but also have you tap into this, well, this wider humanity, that what it means to be human, to feel these things, and to go through this difficult journey that most people want to turn their heads from, whether it's a personal crisis or a national crisis. That opening yourself up truly allows you to not just help them in a way of pity or one-way traffic, but to reflect on who you are as a person or as a nation. And so when you're speaking about doing that as a society, as a foreign society, a member of a foreign society, opening yourself up to see the Myanmar example and then reflecting back on your Myanmar society, to look at this give and take as you describe, in what ways are you not just giving but taking? How is this
Right.
Myanmar experience helping you to reflect on what it means to be to be Vietnamese, to want things for Vietnam, and to be more informed and more active and concerned about the shape and progression of your own country?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and well, I think a lot about these questions of this emotional and psychological
Mm-hmm.
connections
Mm-hmm.
through solidarity,
Mm-hmm.
um, that you mentioned, no? And um, I think, it's the key question that I ask myself is, um, how how we can build solidarity, um, based on a certain level of sympathy, and just there, I think sympathy is the basis of it. um, but you know that's also the challenge of solidarity, because how can we make a Vietnamese person growing up in the city, or in um, or in the countryside of Vietnam, that have experienced relative peace for the past 50 years, um, to be able to imagine and understand the condition that Myanmar revolutionary forces go through, um, in a comprehensive way. Just start from understanding, and I think the connection comes from trying to understand. And that's not limited to Vietnam, right? Obviously, when we talk about neighbors like Thailand, for example, that's also a key question for them. That how can we build sympathy among the Thais
Mm-hmm.
to their neighbors when they don't, unless you really are in the Burma circle and care about migrants from Myanmar, for example,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't see with your eyes the suffering, the atrocity that is going on in Myanmar. Um, and so that lead me to some thoughts on how to build this solidarity, right? Either to build to brainstorm a way that folks outside of Myanmar can see, can build that sympathy to the suffering of folks in Myanmar, or to nurture other forms of solidarity, such as that political imagination,
Mm-hmm.
the bouncing off of ideas, um, the hopes and dreams that for example, the Thai or the Vietnamese activism network is hoping for their own countries. But we looked at the movement in Myanmar and we were just amazed at how far advanced the
Really?
movement in Myanmar is. Absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely. Um,
That's powerful.
and what I mean, that's something that I constantly tell Myanmar friends. And I think when you're deep in the weed, you don't see you you know it's I think it's easier to look from the outside in and just look at the movements in Myanmar, the kind of collective decision that they make, the kind of model that they follow right after the coup in such a stressful time to form some of
Yeah.
the frameworks that they were able to form
Hmm.
to sustain it. Um, it's something that it's quite frankly, literally unimaginable in the context of a country like Vietnam, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I mean the conflict in Vietnam was 50 years ago, so a lot of these languages were not there.
Hmm.
Um, but the languages that we spoke about these days, federalism, transitional justice, uh, um, bottom up democracy, all of these stuff are not even talked about in the 70s in Vietnam. Um, and that give a lot of room for reflections of what kind of revolution we went through.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm using the word revolution in a very very broad sense because there are revolutionary forces in all throughout Vietnam and outside of Vietnam during the war in Vietnam, and so obviously not restricted to um, the the North Vietnamese, um, and I think they're just if we can build this connection of political imagination from Myanmar to the reflection of Vietnam a bit more clearer, a bit more relatable, then it would be a wonderful narrative and space for the movements in Vietnam and elsewhere to learn from their own history through the images and the experience that Myanmar movement is going through right now.
Mm. That's beautiful. And going back to that idea of bringing it to a personal relationship of someone going through a crisis, in those times, I find that the connection between those two individuals does form a kind of a very special contrast and bond, a mirror image of being able to see yourself reflected through the open vulnerability of person on either side in that moment. And so also among nations going through crises, there could be that kind of reflecting mirror to seeing what Myanmar is, the good and the bad, and the positive and the pessimistic, and to be able to see reflected back in Vietnam's journey, history, as well as where it's going.
So I think there are questions um, that a lot of Vietnamese have attempted to answer and to tackle that are the same questions that Myanmar movements
Mm.
is tackling. And so, uh, and looking at how Myanmar movement is answering these questions are important space to look at how the Vietnamese answered these questions and on the consequences of their answers today. Um, so um, just just take some of the examples of the questions. Questions like the domination of the military, the armies, the security force, um, which is obviously the one of the major question in Myanmar, which is also a question in Vietnam back in the Civil War, and also now. And so it it for me the first few months after the coup in Myanmar were just incredible in terms of how collectively the Myanmar movement can categorically saying that this would be a revolution that there would be
Mm.
no compromise, no political endgame beside from a federal democratic Myanmar that does not have a political space for military anymore. And that, I mean, that sounds like a fun slogan for a revolution, but really to get a collective mass to be on the same page on that political finality, um, and in a very bottom up process, rather than having a strong man saying that this is the right way to go, um, is just incredible. It also show that actually then if it takes that little time to arrive at that conclusion, then that must have been something that people have been longing for a long time, and therefore when time comes, the answer was obvious, and therefore once a person say it, the whole crowd were agreeing, and so, and being able to sustain that line very strongly until now, um, which again, it's unimaginable if you don't understand how the Myanmar movements works. Um, and so that's back to Vietnam, right? That's also a question that we deal with also. Um, the there's all kinds of questions of the military and security dominance in the Vietnamese politics, and that's always um, a question that followed Vietnamese politics since the war, on both sides of the war, right? And um, my personal argument is the dominance of the military and the security forces in Vietnam nowadays is the direct consequence of the civil war in Vietnam. In a way that you know we all know that conflicts does a couple of things. One of the key things that it does is it um, it empower military and security forces, um, and masculinize politics. And therefore, when you have a situation under which the end of Vietnam War was done militarily, um, and not only militarily, right, but also in terms of security, a lot of the um, a whole chunk of the reason that the North Vietnam was able to win on the battlefield is because of the security infiltration to the intelligence and all that into the regime in the south. So um, the strength of the security apparatus and the military and the role that these branches both plays in politics in Vietnam was one of the key legacy of the long war in Vietnam in the 20th century up until now. So I think these are the questions that even I think some of the movements in Vietnam do not realize to be the key questions that we need to deal with, and therefore I think if the connection to these questions are clearer between Myanmar and Vietnam and other countries like um, you know, like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, that it's a common threat around the region, that there is a dominance of military and security apparatus in politics, and it is the direct legacy of the colonial time, and the actually the revolution to get out of colonial time, which again empower the military and security mindset. All of that history is here with us, and it only manifested in a way that it does in Myanmar, in the most obvious way. But in each of the countries in Southeast Asia, um, it's there, and it's really the common thread in Southeast Asia that it's becoming obvious and more obvious these days.
So you're really laying out a landscape or a context of authoritarian, sometimes bordering on tyrannical forces that are confronting a groundswell of movement that is looking for more equitable society, human rights, federal democracy, and some form of being able to be rights-driven society. And this, I think this is not just a regional thing. This is where the world is moving to, unfortunately, with where we're seeing, even in the so-called democratic West, we're seeing these forces of authoritarianism, even fascism, and populism, and nationalism in various forms, taking on these outsized interests. It almost seems like there's something in the human psyche that we just keep forgetting the lessons from a couple generations ago, and suddenly some populist just comes along and says a bunch of inflammatory things, and no matter how educated you like to think the electorate is, or how strong the democratic structures, there's just something in the psyche that says, yeah, that sounds like a great fresh new idea, and not realize that it's actually following in a line of many hateful things that lead in the same direction from history that we all know too well. And so, but in Southeast Asia, this is certainly playing out in dramatic ways across the region, but most vividly in Myanmar itself, where you see what the enemies of progress, the support that they're getting, and who is supporting them, and really shamefully those forces trying to resist them, how little supported they are by really anyone, from any side, however messy or imperfect. If there is some model going place that goes against the tide of regional authoritarianism on one hand, or if the reality none of us wish to see, if the military is able to prevail in some atrocious, terrible way, and the international community continues to turn away from it, and authoritarianism does win and prevail here, for a time being, even another generation. Looking at these two stark differences and possible realities, what impact do you see that having on Vietnam and the region, regional actors, governments, regimes, and the people, civil society, in looking at those different scenarios play out? What ripple effects will it have into Vietnam and the region, do you think?
Well, I'll answer that question, but I then will circle back to something that you mentioned, and I think because I think that is very important. Um, the ripple effect that we already see is the kind of very mischievous viewpoint of Myanmar. That that because the narrative is that Myanmar is such a mess,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore, um, just please be happy that you're in a stable, peaceful country,
Right.
right? So that kind of the pointing finger that Myanmar couldn't control their military, therefore
Mm.
they are that way, and if we can control our military and
Mm.
our security, and all that, it's then you should be happy, and that that's and that is an achievement of a slightly authoritarian government, um, and that justify the government to be authoritarian. So that's already one ripple effect that we clearly see in Southeast Asia. Governments in Southeast Asia are trying to play that narrative, and it's a very convenient narrative to a lot of governments. Um, right. Um, and then I want to circle back to a point that you brought up before mm, about winning militarily in Myanmar. Um, right. And I heard a lot of folks talking about how Myanmar military is losing ground. Um, and I think that is one fundamental thing that we have to reflect on, how international media and we think about politics, especially politics during conflicts. Um, con- I think too oftentimes we think of conflicts like a football game,
Mm-hmm.
that that um, it's a fun game to watch every
Mm-hmm.
week to see which side is winning,
Mm-hmm.
who score what. Um, Operation 1027. Yes, they score once, and then they do a comeback. we see it as a spectators, and there's all kinds of problems with that viewpoint. But also that I don't think at all that that's how you should measure and track the progress of revolution and of peace processes, um, because if you ask Myanmar folks in the movements, you know that the defeat of the military junta on the battlefield would not result in a democratic, federal democratic Myanmar. Um, the true, I mean, if you really look at it, the true progress that I see in Myanmar is when all of these small um, factions in Myanmar is able to work together, um, find a modality that they can work together, find a modality that they can find a common vision toward a federal democratic Myanmar, um, and they are really taking the opportunity of this situation to progress very quickly what could not be progressed in the past decades, um, and that's the true progress, I think, right? That's when the countries or even some ethnic groups and um, even ethnic revolutionary organizations are being able to work with civil society organizations, building up their capacity, etc., etc. um, Capacity of federal governments on the local level being strengthened. um, that All of that is major progress in Myanmar that have nothing, or if that have little to do with military um, progress on the battlefield, right? And I think that's also a major reflection that I have on Vietnam. Also, when you look at the international media coverage of the civil war in Vietnam, it was a football game. It was a
Mm.
it on the background of the Cold War also. So the whole world was watching, and there's I think the much more interesting stories and types of progress and political um, battlefield was playing out in both north and south of Vietnam at that point was not at all on the battlefield. It was you know how the north imagined itself to be a true progressive forces that can unite the country, how the south figure out how to be really the alternative to the regime in the north, yet also not a colony of the United States. How both sides play the political cards with the ethnic minorities in Vietnam, how they imagine the end of the Vietnam War and the unification, and how things played out afterward. Um, I think all of these are not covered by media nor discussed by those who are even concerned about Vietnam, um, and that we have to reflect to be able to look at Myanmar correctly and to look at other conflicts correctly. That these currents are, I think, much more important. Um, Although it might be much less entertaining, to a person who read newspapers and watch news.
We have to remember that human lives are at stake here, and
Right.
these are futures of real people living in terrible situations, not just figures on a paper or markers on a battlefield. I totally agree with that. And looking a bit deeper into those Myanmar Vietnam connections, I'm recalling now something I read in one Burma book talking about the guerrilla fighting that happened on the Burma front in World War II and the American soldiers that were involved, and saying that this was actually a precursor for the guerrilla warfare that American soldiers would go on to take part in Vietnam a couple decades later that the American guerrilla experience began in World War II in Burma. Just another kind of lost piece of history connecting these the trajectories of these two countries and how and America's involvement in that, and then tracing that to decades and decades later. One of the things I know that you would like to talk about, one of the more unfortunate aspects of that relationship as it's developed in the last several years, is Mytel. So can you tell us what Mytel is and Vietnam's involvement with that?
Right. So I share what I know about it, and I think there should be a lot that we can do to better understanding how this firm um, is an important link of Vietnam and Myanmar, and how it's affecting the movements in Myanmar. So my as basic information, Mytel is a joint company between Viettel and crony companies of the Myanmar junta. Um, and it's been there, and more, you know about it more than I do. So I don't want to speak about something that I don't know. But I do, I did hear from friends in Myanmar that when Mytel came in, it was a great service that they provided. That it's also a very cheap alternative to a lot of things, a lot of other alternatives that they have in terms of telecom, um, yada yada yada, until the coup, right? And I'm going to only talk about what they do after the coup.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also important to know what Viettel is. Viettel is a either military owned or quasi military owned telecom company in Vietnam. Um, it's quasi or de facto state owned in that sense that they carry out state mandates. Um, um, the t- Viettel also have a very close link to to the Party of Vietnam, to the Communist Party, and the Ministry of Communication. Um, the it cannot be more obvious that the head of Viettel became the Minister of Information and Communication, the current, um, and the I think the vice CEO of Viettel, former vice CEO, became the head of counter, cybersecurity and whatnot of the Ministry of Defense of Vietnam. So you have this very well established triangular relationship between Viettel, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Information and Communication, right? And the political status of Viettel is a company that carry out the telecom function um, as an extension of the military, and also support the state function in terms of providing telecom service to the Vietnamese population, but also to provide cybersecurity and you know certain restrictions of internet freedom, freedom of communication, and whatnot in Vietnam. Um, but so that's what Viettel is, and I think that's very open. Um, in the last decade, I think Viettel has been trying to go global and connect to other countries that it can expand its business. And I don't know if there's any definite things that I can say about the political motivation for going global, beyond a business model of going global. But I know that if you look it up, that Viettel is going to multiple countries, Cambodia, Angola, Myanmar, and so on, countries that do need um, telecom alternatives. So that's its business model, right? I'm not trying to pretend like it only has a, the tentacle of Ministry of Defense all around the world. Um, but it's also just important to remember that Viettel, by nature, is a military-owned company that carry out military-related, security-related functions for the government of Vietnam. And therefore, the types of relationships and the types of partnership that it does um, is through military means. And so I think naturally, um, Viettel, the way that they look at the situation of Myanmar post coup, and the way that they see their advantage of being a military-owned company is that they can whisper things to the military in Myanmar that other telecom company cannot, um, because they know how it works, um, right? So they know how it works, both in terms of like trying to dodge international scrutiny in the way that they collaborate with the military junta, and they have a few playbook up their sleeve on how to crack down on movements and dissidents coming from what they learned from the situation in Vietnam, and how actually Vietnam learned from the playbook of other authoritarian regimes like China. And so they have it on up their sleeve, and they are, I think, this is my analysis and hypothesis, but I think they would be willing to share these playbooks with the military in Myanmar. Um, and in some of my investigation, it seems like they were doing just that. They were um, um, slipping data to the military junta. They do they they do very complicated campaigns to dodge international scrutiny when international scrutiny were looking at other telecom companies like Ooredoo, Telenor. Um, they were able to dodge a lot of these scrutiny. Um, One of the reason is that a lot of international advocacy cannot touch Vietnamese government to do lobbying, to pull out, and it's easier to lobby against some of the other international actors. And so Mytel were able to dodge all that, and they use their cheap service as a selling point to stay in Myanmar. Um, but it's clear also at this point that that Viettel as a company has a very strong political influence in the Vietnamese Myanmar diplomatic relationship, if not kind of one of the um, dic- strongest player that dictates the diplomatic relationship between Myanmar and Vietnam. Um, and the inner circle is very hard to penetrate because they came from the military. And at this point, it's safe to conclude that the partnership uh, is half business and half diplomatic slash military partnership. And so I think that's where we are in terms of Mytel.
That's devastating what you're saying. You're talking about a relationship that is not only military to military, and we know how these relationships are going when it comes to the Burmese military, how it's been able to leverage their relationship with other militaries in the region, to say nothing of Russia, a bit further afield. Talking about crony capitalism and crony business ties that are also involved. And on top of that, which is somewhat news to me, the direct impact it's having on diplomatic ties at the diplomatic level, which shouldn't be a surprise, but is really just contaminating all parts of this. And we should also mention that the PDFs have made news in recent years of blowing up Mytel towers to
Right.
show their dissatisfaction and their knowledge of Vitel's involvement in being a player to support their murderous regime. So this is this is a lot to absorb, the depth of the contamination of the relationship and where Vietnam stands towards it. And so, is there you seem to be describing all top leadership and players in Vietnam politics, business, and military in having a stake in the military's continued rule. Is that correct to say? Is there pushback from some parties or leaders, or is media covering this for the importance that this story is to be known? How would you characterize this, the last few years of Vietnam Myanmar ties?
Well, I mean, it's so much outside of attention of people. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's there's not a lot of kind of public pushback
Mm-hmm.
against it. Um, and when there were reports from Justice for Myanmar, for example, that came out and made it up to Vietnamese media, it's the usual pushback from the media, from the Vietnamese propaganda machine,
Mm-hmm.
that it's the dissidents of Vietnam trying to drum up, fabricated um, arguments against the Communist Party, yada yada yada. Um, and so that's yeah. So that's the kind of little noise that it created. Um, but just to look at the post coup Mytel, right? Um, Mytel suffered loss obviously after the coup, major loss, when Viettel Global was was reporting a lot of revenue in 2021. Um, the only market that suffer a lot of loss were Myanmar, and we and they did not pull out. They did not even. It seems like they make plans to pull out, which give me a thought, a hypothesis that there's probably a political assurance,
Mm-hmm.
um, that the existence of Mytel and Viettel in Myanmar is much more than a business,
Mm-hmm.
than a political tie. That if you can, the message is, if you can suffer through this financially, um, you are carrying a much more important political mission.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's I don't know the latest data, but if it seems to pay off, given that a lot of competitors of Mytel doesn't have that political insurance. So a lot of them went through a lot of restructuring, etc., and Mytel were able to dodge a lot of attention that should have been there to crack it down.
Mm. And to what degree has Vietnam legitimized the Myanmar military after their coup? To what degree have they had involvement or rejected involvement in anything relating to the NUG? And I know you study the issue of migration. Is there any sizable migration of Burmese to Vietnam, and what is their condition and safety like?
Hmm. Um, well, to the last question, I don't actually know if there's any migration from Burmese from Myanmar to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
There are if there's any connection, it's the some of the cases of Vietnamese who were um, being trafficked to scam centers in
Right.
in the border,
Mm-hmm.
in Shan State and elsewhere. Um, and so the noises that Vietnamese governments have been making has been concentrated on that, on the scam centers, and saving the Vietnamese. Beside from that, I think Vietnam is trying as hard as it can to stay away from the conflict, or stay away from making any tough decision. Um, and it's very unfortunate, and I think part of the part of the hesitance of Vietnam to make a stronger stance is Viettel.
Another topic I'd like to get to, before we started recording, you had referenced your background in peace building, and you asked a rhetorical question that I found quite interesting that I'd like to have you ask here rhetorically and flesh out the difficulty in unpacking the question itself, perhaps even more so than the answer. That rhetorical question being, is Myanmar in a peace building process? And uh, if they are not, then what are the steps leading to when that would begin? And that relates to your work on the frameworks of peace building that your background goes into. So, can you pick that up?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Myanmar is definitely going through a peace building process.
Mhm.
Um, and in fact, I would even argue that from the outsider perspective, from at least from my own perspective, um, the 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 progress that Myanmar has been moving, um, the fastest is actually peace building, not not military. Um, so if you think of how Myanmar movements have been in constructing, formulating all these frameworks toward a federal democratic Myanmar, how they've been trying to work out the constitutions that is inclusive for all, how they really brainstorm and realize um, bottom up federal democracy, building of local governance systems, um, kind of a feasible inner working between um, armed groups, revolutionary groups, civil society groups, women's group, etc., on a local level. All of that is obviously peace building, right? By definition, um, we're just in we're just talking about the context, a country context under which there was a 10 years period of peace process, and which lead us to a situation that we are now in. And therefore a peace, the word peace process or peace building or and ceasefire, whatever, is looked at from a cautious eyes, um, and it should be, because it can both be manipulated by international and domestic players to twist the wish of the Myanmar people um, toward some sort of compromise, political
Yeah,
settlements with the military,
right.
without neglecting the terms of that political settlement that Myanmar movements want, um, or that it's an excuse of a lot of folks with older mindset of peace building in Myanmar to kickstart some of the old-fashioned way to build peace in Myanmar, that is coming from outside rather than organically from the ground in Myanmar. So all of this skepticism is very legitimate, um, and so and so my so I work in peace building in Southeast Asia, and to broaden the scope of the conversation a bit, we know that the conversation around peace building in Southeast Asia is not as straightforward as perhaps other contexts, because in virtually all of the contexts in Southeast Asia, it's a it's it's a long process of colonial struggle, going into a transition period.
Mhm.
Many of them are military dictatorship, um, and afterward it's a transitional justice period, and a lot of cleaning up after the conflict. And cleaning up here meaning not only development but also how to de masculinize politics, how to re-democratize politics, how to how to imagine further how to build a civilian governance, inclusive governance, that that militaristic, securitaristic mindset is boxed in its own space, and not overwhelming civilian politics, right? And so peace building in Southeast Asia has always been a conversation of revolution,
Mm-hmm.
of anti dictatorship, of anti militaristic, of inclusive um, uh, state building that is locally led. Um, and so all of that obviously is there in Myanmar. Um, I think it's just the language itself that we have to find a different kind of language, or even to reclaim the language of peace building in Southeast Asia that really reflects a solidarity of the peace building experience across the region, from the Bangsamoro in the Philippines, Aceh in Indonesia, Timor Leste, or even back to the time of Vietnam, when there's a lot of lessons that need to be reflected, but it was too much of a taboo topic to touch.
This is a pivotal moment, I think, in the development of these different movements and governments in the Southeast Asian region. Are you hopeful going forward?
I agree that it's a pivotal moment. It's a moment in which um, the security and military dominance in the region became abundantly obvious,
Mm-hmm.
and also abundantly obvious that it's a trend across the region, not only you know, not only in specific countries like Thailand, that they talk about military um, dominance a lot, but also in other contexts that the security force is also taking over. So it is a pivotal moment in the way that it's more visible um, than it ever used to be in the past years. Um, I'm looking at the movements. I think I'm hopeful of the regional movement, that it's something that binds the movement together. Um, Myanmar is a source of inspiration everywhere. Um, and this is me speaking directly to friends in Myanmar, that they should understand that they are the source of inspiration, and the source of ideas and reflections, um, and to the level that they don't recognize, right? Because there are a lot of reflections that goes on in corners of Vietnam and of Cambodia, of Laos, that is not there on media,
Yeah.
but it's imminent. Um, and I think there would be moments in which all of these bonds are come together, um, and it would be a regional movements that push back. Um, am I optimistic about the outcome of it? I don't know whether I can find any conclusion to it. Um, nor it's something that I want it to occupy my energy. I think process is important. I think process is much more important actually than results. So I'm optimistic of the process. Um, the result, history will tell.
Mm. Thank you for that. The last topic I want to bring to you is your other area of expertise, and that's migration, and particularly looking at migration in the Mekong area. And you've looked at it over the last number of years. Of course, since the coup, it's taken on a whole other dimension, especially in Thailand and other neighboring countries, and especially after the conscription laws in Myanmar. Of course, we're talking about specifically. I know you've studied migration in a larger scale, and that might relate to the specific focus that we're talking about in Myanmar at this time. So feel free to bring that into it. But I wonder if you can give us some background on what your studies and analysis into migration would be relevant today in looking at the ongoing crisis in Myanmar and what we're seeing and how that's spilling over the borders and what we might anticipate as it goes forward.
Hmm. I think when it comes from when it's about migration in Myanmar, it's always a complicating topic, especially in Thailand. Um, but we can also broaden the scope of our reflection to a few decades before, right? That Thailand in the 70s, in the 80s, were a hub of refugees
Mhm.
coming from um, Vietnam. A lot of them
Yeah.
come from Vietnam, and I've seen storytelling of Vietnamese refugees in Thailand that they were sharing camps with Myanmar and
Hmm.
Cambodian folks,
I see.
and so you know there were all of that stories, and it's harder to imagine um, that exists in if we're locked our viewpoint to the current situation of the welcoming or unwelcoming of migration into Thailand. Um, there's obviously we hear a lot of frustration from Myanmar folks about Thailand reaping a lot of benefits and profits from migration from Myanmar, the cheap labor from Myanmar.
Hmm.
But then when when Myanmar actually needed it,
Hmm.
um, Thailand distanced themselves from welcoming. Um, but I also don't want to box this conversation into Thailand either. All the all other countries, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, all of them have experience of other countries helping refugees from their context there when conflicts were going on in their countries, and with some history of helping refugees and migrants from other countries too. Um, but it's I think because of the narrative of national security these days around migration, um, it becomes they become increasingly distant from the experience of helping other conflict contexts than they did in the past.
Hmm.
Um, and that's you know and I bring back to a bit of my personal interest also on Southeast Asia as a region. Um, there's someone who told me that Southeast Asia is the most is the region that makes the most sense
Hmm.
in the war,
Hmm.
because it should be a region. Um, it's historically, anthropologically, a region in which the movements surrounding or circulating around the region have been going on for centuries, and it makes the most sense as a region than a lot of other regions that we call them as
Hmm.
regions
Hmm.
nowadays, which is more about geopolitics than history, um, and belonging. Um, and so I think the past 2,000 years, um, you know, all these countries in Southeast Asia belong to the region of Southeast Asia. Even when you look back at the 20th century, the movements around Southeast Asia um, are interlinked. Um, the the there's a lot of interlink between the movements in the revolutions in Vietnam to that in Indonesia, the
Hmm.
colonial struggle, um, share around the same time, uh, with Vietnam not only within Indochina but also elsewhere, Indonesia, certainly even Myanmar. Um, and so all of these links are there, um, and I think it's just the last bit of a few decades that kind of development, neoliberal development kicks in, and it creates, it's completely distance the memory of Southeast Asians away from the belonging that they have on fellow Southeast Asia um, countries and peoples. And I think that's the root of the apathy to migrants and refugees all around Southeast Asia nowadays. Um, it's the void of memory that the past decades have carved out, that cut Southeast Asia off from their roots and their belonging.
That's really powerfully said. I really thank you for coming on to share these views, and for someone who didn't know how much they would have to share, you've shared quite a bit, and I think we could keep on going. You have quite a lot of insight and personal stories and study and inspiration to give us. I really thank you for this time and for sharing as much as you've done. This has just been a jam-packed hour of all these great topics and insights that you brought to us.
Well, I think just I guess just a last a few words to Myanmar friends. Just want to re-emphasize what I said before. That in many ways, in many unexpected, unimaginable ways, that the Myanmar movements is really inspiring and helping friends in the region. And do count on us when we you need anything from us. We're there. And thanks for this opportunity. I hope that this is helpful for those who listen.
As inspiring as today's guest was, I know from experience that when you're listening from so far away, there can also be a certain kind of helplessness in hearing about the people's dire struggles. Thankfully, our nonprofit offers a reliable way for interested listeners to provide financial assistance to those local communities who need it most. Your donations will be sent to support urgent humanitarian missions, as well as those vulnerable peoples being impacted by the military coup. By taking an active role in supporting the movement, you can help ensure that people like today's speaker have even a few more resources to draw on and can manage just another week in continuing their efforts. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement (CDM), families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Saraba Yarananga Unyana Dadu Yadanan Zadamana, we got a Besayana, Besayo. Oba Yarananda Dayananga Yaranaya Dayanamboda Yaranam.